arc is a framework that actually allows us to experience a story and take on ideas as if they're our own. And what's happening in our brain when we hear stories is what actually allows us to do that. So when you hear a story, your brain releases cortisol, which is related to memories. It releases dopamine, which keeps us engaged. We all talk about the dopamine of scrolling, but stories release dopamine, so they keep you emotionally engaged. And oxytocin, which I think oxytocin is related to empathy. So when you put the memories, the engagement, the empathy, you put that together, and stories are the only way that, you can allow a brain to turn someone else's experience and feel it as if it's your own. And so that's what's so powerful. It kind of puts you in someone else's shoes. So obviously that's incredibly powerful for marketing. You want to engage someone and kind of bring them to that moment of need. Like, oh yeah, I have that feeling when I, need that sort of pain point addressed by this product. But yeah, it's, they help us understand meaning. They give us meaning and interpretation as if it's an experience. And that's what's truly powerful about it.
That's really cool. I like the idea of, like you said, the cortisol and then the oxytocin. And so the sort of the empathy cross with the memory, because definitely there's a number of things when you were saying that, I was thinking of stories that I've been told once, but they still stick. They're still there, and I still use them as a frame of reference when I'm talking to others about a particular subject. And it's interesting that I got told that story once, but I felt as if I had lived it, and therefore it stuck in my mind, and the amazing sort of aspect that has on it. And when you were talking about business, I was thinking Nike do a really good example of this in a lot of what they do with kind of Find Your Greatness or Dream Crazier and stuff like that, where you do feel part of it and you feel like you're part of that movement, that thing. So what are some things that people can do to start to build stories, to find stories, to leverage story in a way that can benefit them personally, but also with their business?
So I always use a very simple strategic structure. This is not like proprietary by any means, and it's not even proprietary to marketing. I think about the 4 C's as an input structure to understand how to build a story. And the 4 C's would be context, a starting point, what's something, we can all agree on, or even, if you're introducing a new idea, what's a truth about culture or the category? So what's the context for the story? The customer, because we want stories to kind of create that connection, that mental connection, you really want to tap into empathy. Who is the person you're sharing your story with, your audience or your customer at the other side of the story? And what do they feel? What do they want? What do they need? What pain points do they have? What barriers do they have to overcome? And understanding that, that snapshot, you kind of find like, what's the anchoring point? How are you going to hook them into your story? Competitive or collaborative? I don't think we don't necessarily need to think of our competitive set anymore. Partner marketing is a huge part of our work in B2B marketing. And, how do you position yourselves either against or with, or where you are in your space with your competitive set? What is everyone else saying? Where is their white space? Or, what else do you need to say to put yourself in category if if it's not entirely clear what you are? And then your company, your brand, your product. And if you think about those 4 C's, if you kind of get to like a clarity, a point of insight and clear takeaway, I put them on a grid, and then I look at like, a USP or a value proposition, but, what is the core of this story going to be in a way that's culturally or contextually relevant, resonant with our audience, either clearly differentiated or, connecting to our competitors and collaborators, and totally true and authentic about who we are as a company. And so those 4 things, I think if you, go through that exercise, you can find a story that really helps you connect with where you want to be and meaningfully with your audience.
That's really cool. I like that. I like the idea of like you said, the tension between to almost, and I like when you said, what's this story going to be? How am I going to tell this story? I love that idea of looking at that and thinking this story can be, as long as it's authentic, like you said, it can be whatever it needs to be. And I think seeing that story and kind of developing that narrative, and then I guess everything else hanging off of that, kind of coming from that. Yeah, I love that idea from a creative perspective. Again, similar to yourself, left brain, right brain kind of thing. I love the kind of strategy and the creativity, and that sounds really cool. And there's two questions I want to ask, but one of them I want to ask first is what are some of the ones that have been those sort of moments where you've just been like, I'm really enjoying this. This is so cool to work on this.
Oh my gosh, that's such a hard question to answer. I'm not someone who can answer questions like, what's your favorite? I will say my most favorite projects to work on are the ones that kind of like unlock this aha, unbelievable sort of tension or connection across all of the different inputs. And you find this combination that is just, oh my gosh, that's like a completely new expression. And, I've never heard those two words put together before. And that idea is just so contradictory and yet captures everything. Like those sort of unlocks that are so, so fun to stumble upon in pulling ideas together. Those make projects really fun. And I had one just last week. It was for a technology product. And I am by no means a technophile or a technology sort of advocate in any way, despite the work that I do all the time. So I think it's less about the products themselves or what I'm sort of telling the story on. Is just finding those unlocks that are just so exciting and so cool. Little discoveries. I also love my favorite part about the work, after you go through a discovery process and you get to like a strategic sentiment, or you're taking a client through the journey of the discovery, which really tells the story across all those inputs. And then you kind of get it to a landing point. It's just so fun when they're there for the journey and they love where you land. I was telling a story for an executive coach who actually used to be a very well-known woman in the branding world who's now coaching. And I took her through my story immersion process, and I'm telling her coaching story. Let me replay back to you everything we just workshopped and where we landed. And she closed her eyes, and I took her through the journey of the board that we were working on. And she was like, how do you do that? Like, it's not me. I mean, I feel like I'm drawing it out of you, but it's those moments where it's just like, it all falls into place and it just comes to this very cool sort of expression.